I was standing in my own kitchen, holding a tray of champagne flutes for my own wedding anniversary party, when my daughter-in-law Jessica looked me straight in the eye and said, "The help belongs in the kitchen, not mingling with the guests." The room went dead silent for exactly 3 heartbeats, and then her friend started laughing like she'd delivered the punchline to the world's funniest joke. 47 years I'd been married to Robert. 47 years of building a life, raising 3 children, working my way up from a bank teller to bank president while he pursued his artistic dreams. This party was supposed to celebrate us, our endurance, our love that had weathered decades of storms and emerged stronger. Instead, I was being treated like hired staff in the home I'd lived in longer than Jessica had been breathing. The worst part wasn't even Jessica's words. It was watching my son Scott's face as he pretended not to hear her. He found something fascinating in his wine glass, studied it like it contained the secrets of the universe. My Scott, who I'd taught to ride a bike, who'd called me his hero when I helped him with calculus homework, who'd sobbed in my arms when his first girlfriend broke his heart. Now he was 32, married for 6 months, and apparently his spine had dissolved along with his loyalty. "Mom's just trying to help," he mumbled, not looking up from that wine glass. Help? As if this party hadn't been my idea, my planning, my money paying for the catered food and expensive wine his new wife was guzzling like it was water. I've learned something about humiliation over the years. It has a very particular weight. It settles in your chest like a stone, cold and heavy, making it hard to breathe. But I also learned something else during my climb from teller to president. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. "Of course, dear," I said, my voice steady as still water. "I'll just take care of the kitchen duties." Jessica's smile was triumphant, sugar-sweet with a core of pure malice. She'd won, or so she thought. Her friends were still tittering, exchanging glances that said, "Can you believe she lets her daughter-in-law talk to her that way?" My husband Robert was across the room, deep in conversation with his art dealer friend, oblivious to the small war being waged near the appetizer table. I retreated to the kitchen, that sacred space where I'd fed my family for decades, where I'd helped with homework and bandaged scraped knees and had countless heart-to-heart conversations that built the foundation of my children's lives. Now I was exiled here, not as the matriarch, but as the servant. The thing about being 68 years old is that you've accumulated a lot of quiet rage. Not the explosive kind, that burns out fast and leaves you empty. No, this was the slow-burning kind, the kind that has been fed by 40 years of small slights and dismissals, of being taken for granted by people who should know better. I arranged more appetizers on serving platters, my hands steady despite the storm building in my chest. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see Jessica holding court in my living room, gesturing with her wine glass as she told some story that had her friends laughing. She was beautiful, I'll give her that. 25 years old, with the kind of effortless blonde hair that costs a fortune to maintain, and the sort of figure that made men lose their ability to think clearly. My son had definitely lost his ability to think clearly. The marriage had been a whirlwind. They'd met in January, engaged by March, married by September. "When you know," Scott had said, his eyes shining with what I'd hoped was love but was beginning to suspect was something much more dangerous. Infatuation mixed with lust and seasoned with the kind of desperation that makes middle-aged men do foolish things. I tried to like Jessica, really tried. When Scott first brought her home, I saw a young woman who seemed overwhelmed by everything. Our house, our family traditions, the weight of suddenly being part of something that had existed long before she arrived. I'd been gentle with her, invited her to help with holiday planning, included her in family decisions. I thought I was being welcoming. What I didn't realize was that Jessica saw my kindness as weakness, my inclusion as obligation. She didn't want to be part of our family. She wanted to replace it with something that suited her better. The first red flag should have been the house discussion. Scott and Jessica had been looking at homes, or so they said. Every property they toured had something wrong with it. Too small, too far from downtown, too expensive. Then Jessica started making casual comments about how much space Robert and I had in this big old house, how empty it must feel with all the children grown and gone. "It seems silly," she'd said one Sunday dinner, "keeping all this space when there are young families who really need it." Robert had laughed it off, but I'd felt that familiar weight settling in my chest. I'd built my career reading between the lines of what people said, understanding the subtext in loan applications and business proposals. Jessica wasn't making casual conversation, she was conducting a survey. The second red flag was the way she started treating family gatherings like her personal events. She'd show up early, rearrange my furniture, change the music I'd selected, even replace the flowers I'd arranged with ones she'd bought. I just want everything to be perfect, Isho, she'd say, when I'd find my carefully planned table settings reorganized to suit her aesthetic. Scott would shrug when I mentioned it to him. She just wants to contribute, Mom. She's trying to fit in. But fitting in and taking over are two very different things, and I was watching Jessica systematically do the latter. The third and final red flag was tonight. This moment, standing in my own kitchen while she held court in my living room, dismissed me like I was nothing more than inconvenient help that needed to be managed. I finished arranging the last platter and stood there for a moment, really thinking. In the 47 years Robert and I had been married, we'd faced plenty of challenges. His art career had been slow to take off, leaving me as the primary breadwinner for the first 15 years of our marriage. I'd worked nights to finish my business degree while caring for 3 young children. I'd taken calculated risks, made strategic career moves, built relationships that opened doors. By the time I was 35, I was a loan officer. By 40, I was assistant manager. By 50, I was vice president of lending. And for the past 8 years, I'd been president of Riverside Community Bank, overseeing assets worth over $200 million and serving a community that had watched me grow from a young mother balancing checkbooks to a respected businesswoman who could approve or deny loans that changed people's lives. But somehow, in my own home, I'd become invisible. My accomplishments, my intelligence, my decades of experience managing complex financial situations, none of that mattered to Jessica. To her, I was just Scott's mother, an obstacle to be managed, or, failing that, humiliated into compliance. I picked up the platter of cheese and crackers and walked back into the living room. Jessica was talking about some spa weekend she wanted to plan, something expensive that would require Scott to ask us for money, no doubt. Her friends were nodding along, playing their roles in the performance of wealthy young wives whose biggest concerns were which resort to visit and which designer bag to buy next. "There she is," Jessica said brightly as I approached with the food. "Thank you so much for taking care of the serving duties. You're so good at the domestic things." The domestic things. As if running a household and managing a bank required completely different skill sets. As if the ability to plan, organize, budget, and execute complex projects was somehow less valuable when applied to family life rather than business. "My pleasure," I said. Ik ben een prayer," I said, setting the platter down on the coffee table Robert and I had bought during our 5th anniversary trip to Vermont. Everything in this room had a history, a story, a memory attached to it. But Jessica looked at it all like it was just furniture, just stuff that happened to be in the way of whatever she was planning. I glanced over at Scott, who was finally looking at me with something that might have been guilt. Too little, too late, I thought. He'd had 6 months of marriage to establish boundaries, to protect his mother from his wife's casual cruelty. Instead, he'd chosen the path of least resistance, letting Jessica set the tone for how I'd be treated in my own family. Robert was still oblivious, laughing with his friend about some gallery opening they were planning to attend. At 70, he had the luxury of being selectively deaf when social situations became uncomfortable. It was a skill he'd developed over the years, one that had served him well in his artistic career, but was less helpful in navigating family dynamics. "I was just telling everyone about our house hunting adventures," Jessica said, her voice carrying that particular tone women use when they're about to say something they know is inappropriate but are going to say it anyway. "It's so frustrating trying to find something with enough space for entertaining. Everything in our price range is just so cramped." Our price range. Scott made decent money as a software engineer, but Jessica had quit her job as a boutique manager the moment they'd gotten engaged. Apparently, being a wife was going to be her full-time occupation, though from what I could see, she was treating it more like a part-time hobby. "Well," said Rebecca, one of Jessica's friends, "young couples always start small. That's what makes it an adventure." Jessica's laugh had an edge to it. "I suppose, though it does seem wasteful when there's so much unused space in the family. I mean, what do 2 people need with 5 bedrooms? 5 bedrooms that had housed our 3 children, that had provided space for Robert's art studio, that had welcomed countless guests over the decades. 5 bedrooms that represented 47 years of mortgage payments, of careful financial planning, of choosing to invest in our home rather than in more frivolous expenses. The weight in my chest was growing heavier, but alongside it was something else. A crystalline clarity I recognized from my banking career. It was the feeling I got when someone walked into my office with a business proposal that was so fundamentally flawed, so obviously doomed to failure, that I could see the ending from the very beginning. Jessica was overplaying her hand, and she didn't even realize it. Space is wonderful, I said mildly, when you've earned it. The conversation paused just for a moment. Jessica's eyes sharpened like she was trying to determine whether I'd just insulted her. The thing about subtle communication is that it allows people to show their true colors. A secure person would have let the comment pass. An insecure person would have laughed it off, but someone with malicious intent would escalate. Jessica chose escalation. "Oh, I think everyone earns their space eventually," she said, her voice honey-sweet with poisoned undertones. "It's just a matter of time and circumstances changing." Circumstances changing. There it was, laid out as clearly as a business proposal. Jessica wasn't just hoping we'd downsize, she was planning on it. She wasn't just making casual comments about our house, she was making a case for why it should become her house. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw something that broke my heart. He wasn't just avoiding eye contact anymore, he was nodding slightly, like he was agreeing with his wife's not-so-subtle suggestion. My Scott, who I'd taught to value loyalty and respect, who I'd raised to understand that family means protecting each other, was sitting in my living room and agreeing that his parents should give up their home so he and his new wife could have it. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. All those years of sacrifice, of working double shifts to pay for his college, of being there for every milestone and disappointment, of loving him unconditionally, and this was how little it meant to him. But the thing about betrayal is that it clarifies everything. It burns away all the complicated emotions and leaves you with simple, clean choices. I excused myself again, went back to the kitchen, and stood at the window overlooking the garden Robert and I had planted together over the decades. The roses were still blooming, even in late October, their late-season flowers smaller but more intensely colored than their summer counterparts. Survivors, I thought, like me. I pulled out my phone and opened my contacts, scrolling to a name I hadn't called in months. Benjamin Gray, the bank's head of lending. David, who worked weekends, who answered calls at all hours because he understood that banking wasn't just about numbers. It was about people's lives, their dreams, their futures. "David, it's Rachel. I hope I'm not interrupting your evening." "Yes, I know it's Sunday, but I need you to pull a file for me first thing tomorrow morning. The Morrison account, Scott Morrison. I need a complete review of the loan terms, payment history, and current status. No, there's no problem with the account. I just need to refresh my memory on some details. Scott Morrison." My son had kept his surname when he married, something I'd appreciated at the time. Now I was realizing it might be the only wise decision he'd made in the past year, because Scott Morrison, software engineer, had taken out a mortgage for $485,000 6 months ago to buy the house he and Jessica now lived in. The loan had been processed through our bank, though not by me. I'd recused myself from any involvement in my son's financial affairs to avoid any appearance of impropriety. But I was still the bank president, and Scott Morrison was still just another customer who'd signed a contract promising to pay back every penny of that loan, with interest, according to the terms he'd agreed to. I hung up and went back to the party, carrying another tray of appetizers. Jessica was in full performance mode now, telling her friends about some charity event she wanted to organize, some fundraiser that would require someone with real business connections to make successful. "I was thinking," she said, glancing at me as I set down the tray, "that it would be perfect for someone like Rachel to get involved. She has all those banking contacts and she's got so much free time now." Free time, as if being bank president was a part-time hobby I pursued when I wasn't busy being a domestic servant for her entertainment. "What kind of charity work?" I asked, genuinely curious about how deep her presumption would go. "Oh, something for young families, I think. Maybe helping with down payments for first-time home buyers. You could use your position to, help deserving people get approved for loans they might not otherwise qualify for." There it was. She wasn't just asking me to donate my time. She was asking me to abuse my position, to compromise my professional ethics, to risk everything I'd built over 4 decades so she could play philanthropist with other people's money. The room went quiet again. Even her friends seemed to understand that she'd just suggested something inappropriate. In the banking world, what Jessica was describing wasn't charity. It was fraud. Using my position to approve unqualified loans would be grounds for termination, criminal prosecution, and the destruction of my reputation. But Jessica didn't understand the banking world. She understood manipulation and entitlement and the belief that other people existed to serve her needs. "That's not how banking works," I said quietly. "Oh, I know it's complicated," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "But surely there are ways to Be flexible with the rules when it's for a good cause. Flexible with the rules. In banking, we had a term for that: embezzlement. I looked around the room at these people in my home eating my food, drinking my wine, listening to my daughter-in-law suggest that I commit federal crimes to fund her social ambitions. And I realized that I was done. Not done with the evening, done with all of it. Done being treated like a resource to be exploited. Done watching my son enable his wife's disrespect. Done pretending that any of this was acceptable. "Excuse me," I said, setting down the empty tray. "I need to make a phone call." I went to Robert's study, closed the door, and called my attorney. "Helen, it's Rachel. I'm sorry to bother you on a Sunday evening, but I need to ask you about estate planning. Specifically about revocable trusts and how quickly assets can be transferred. Yes, I know it's sudden, but sometimes circumstances change faster than we expect." Heather Collins, no relation to my son, just one of those coincidences that small towns produce, had been handling our legal affairs for 15 years. She was sharp, discreet, and understood that when successful people made sudden changes to their estate plans, it was usually because they'd discovered something that demanded immediate action. "I want to establish a trust," I told her. "All assets, including the house, to be transferred into it immediately. Robert and I will maintain lifetime tenancy, but ownership will rest with the trust. The beneficiaries? I'll send you a list tomorrow, but I can tell you right now that my son Scott is no longer included." There was a pause. Helen had known Scott since he was a child. "Rachel, are you sure about this? These kinds of changes?" "I'm completely sure. How quickly can we make this happen?" "If you're certain, we can have the paperwork ready by Wednesday. But Rachel, I have to ask, is Scott aware of your decision?" I thought about my son out in the living room, nodding along with his wife's suggestions that I commit federal crimes to fund her charity fantasies, staying silent while she treated me like domestic help in my own home. "No," I said, "and I'd prefer it stay that way until the paperwork is finalized." When I returned to the party, the dynamics had shifted slightly. Robert had joined the main group and was telling one of his rambling stories about art school in the 1970s. He was a good storyteller, always had been, and even Jessica's friends were listening with genuine interest. But Jessica herself looked bored, checking her phone repeatedly and making little huffing sounds that suggested she found her father-in-law's stories tedious, which broke my heart a little because Robert's stories were part of our family's history. They were the foundation of who we were, the shared narrative that connected us across decades. Jessica didn't want to be part of that narrative. She wanted to replace it with something that centered entirely on her. "That's fascinating, Robert," she said when he paused to take a sip of wine. "You've had such an interesting life. It must be hard to slow down now that you're, well, at this stage." At this stage. Robert was 70, not 90, and he was still actively creating art, still teaching workshops, still vital and engaged with the world. But Jessica spoke about him like he was already halfway to the grave. "I don't feel like I'm slowing down," Robert said mildly. "If anything, I feel like I'm just hitting my stride." "Of course," Jessica said, her tone suggesting she thought he was deluding himself. "But realistically, at some point, you and Rachel will want to think about simplifying your lives. This house is so much to maintain." There it was again, the same message delivered with slightly different words. Robert and I were too old, too frail, too irrelevant to deserve our own home. We should simplify, downsize, get out of the way so the next generation could take over. I watched Robert's face as he processed what his daughter-in-law was really saying. He might choose selective deafness when it suited him, but he wasn't stupid. He could read between the lines as well as anyone. "Well, he said carefully, "we've never found it difficult to maintain, and we love this house." "Oh, I'm sure you do," Jessica said quickly, realizing she might have overplayed her hand with Robert as well. "I just meant that as you get older, having less to worry about might be nice. More time for your art." More time for his art, as if Robert's art wasn't already the center of his life, as if he needed Jessica's permission to prioritize his creative work. I looked at my husband, this man I'd loved for nearly 5 decades, who'd supported my career dreams even when it meant he had to take on more childcare responsibilities, who'd celebrated every one of my promotions like it was his own victory, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. I saw anger. Robert was finally understanding what I'd been dealing with for months. The casual disrespect, the presumptuous suggestions, The way Jessica treated both of us like inconvenient obstacles to be managed rather than people to be respected. You know, Robert said, his voice still mild but with an undertone of steel I recognized from the few times over the years when he'd truly lost his temper. I think Rachel and I are managing just fine. We've been making decisions about our lives for quite a while now. The room went quiet. Jessica's friends were suddenly fascinated by their wine glasses, sensing the tension but not sure what had caused it. Scott, bless his conflict-avoidant heart, tried to smooth things over. Dad, I don't think Jessica meant— I know exactly what Jessica meant, Robert said calmly, and I think it's time we change the subject. It was a gentle rebuke, but it was still a rebuke. Jessica's cheeks flushed red, and for the first time all evening, she looked unsure of herself. I felt a surge of love for my husband so strong it almost brought tears to my eyes. After months of watching our son fail to defend us, Robert had finally drawn a line in the sand. But Jessica wasn't the type to retreat gracefully. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. I was just trying to be helpful, she said, her voice taking on a hurt tone that suggested we were being unreasonably mean to her. I care about you both, and I worry about you managing all this space as you get older. As we get older. Not if we get older, when we need help, if our health fails. As we get older, as if our current ages automatically rendered us incapable of making decisions about our own lives. Jessica Pigche, I said quietly, Robert and I have been managing our lives successfully for decades. We don't need you to worry about us. Of course not, she said quickly. I just meant— You meant that you think we're too old to live in our own home, Isaiah. I said, my voice still quiet but carrying the kind of authority I used in the boardroom when someone was trying to manipulate me. You think we should downsize so that younger people like you and Scott, can have access to what we've built. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Even Jessica seemed to understand that she'd been caught, that her months of subtle suggestions and casual comments had been seen for exactly what they were. That's not— I would never— she stammered. Yes, you would, I said calmly. And you have been for months. But here's what you don't understand, Jessica. This house isn't just a piece of real estate. It's our home. It's where we raised our children, where we've built our life together. It's not up for discussion, negotiation, or redistribution. Jessica's face cycled through several emotions: embarrassment, anger, and finally, something that looked almost like panic. She'd built her entire strategy around the assumption that Robert and I were too polite, too accommodating, too concerned with family harmony to call her out directly. She'd miscalculated badly. I think, said Rebecca, one of Jessica's friends, we should probably get going. Thank you so much for a lovely evening. The others murmured agreement, suddenly eager to escape the tension that had settled over the room like a heavy blanket. They gathered their purses and coats with the efficient speed of people who'd recognized a social disaster and wanted to get clear of the wreckage. Jessica had no choice but to play the gracious hostess, thanking everyone for coming and making vague plans to get together soon. But I could see the humiliation in her eyes, the rage at being exposed in front of her friends. When the last guest had left, the four of us stood in the suddenly quiet living room. The party debris, wine glasses and appetizer plates and crumpled napkins made the space look sad and a little pathetic. Well, Bissell, Scott said with forced brightness. That was nice. Thanks for hosting, Mom. Nice. As if the evening hadn't ended with his mother publicly dressing down his wife for months of disrespectful behavior. Scott, I said, I think you and Jessica need to leave as well. He looked stunned. Mom, come on. We don't have to make a big deal out of this. A big deal? I repeated. Your wife spent the evening treating me like hired help, suggested that your father and I are too old to live in our own home, and then asked me to commit federal crimes to fund her charity fantasies. Exactly which part of that shouldn't be a big deal? Jessica finally found her voice. I never asked you to commit crimes. You asked me to use my position at the bank to approve loans for people who wouldn't otherwise qualify. In the banking world, we call that fraud. I was talking about charity work. You were talking about using my professional position for personal gain. Yours specifically. Jessica looked to Scott for support, but he was staring at the floor like it contained the answers to all of life's mysteries. Scott, she said sharply, are you going to let your mother talk to me this way? And there it was, the moment of truth. The choice between his wife and his mother, between keeping the peace and doing what was right. Scott lifted his head and looked at me with something that might have been regret. "Mom, I think you're overreacting," he said quietly. "Jessica didn't mean anything by it. She was just trying to be helpful." The betrayal was complete. After everything, the months of watching his wife disrespect me, the evening of being treated like a servant in my own home, the suggestion that I'd compromise my professional ethics, he was still choosing Jessica's comfort over my dignity. "I see," I said. "Well then, I think we have nothing more to discuss." Robert stepped up beside me, his presence solid and supportive. "I think you two should go," he said quietly. Scott's face crumpled a little, like he was finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd just done. But it was too late for regret. Jessica, sensing victory, smiled that sugar-sweet smile again. "Of course. We'll talk when everyone's had time to calm down." As if I was the one having an emotional breakdown, as if I needed time to come to my senses and apologize for standing up for myself. They gathered their things and left, Jessica's heels clicking on the hardwood floors I'd had refinished 3 years ago. The sound echoed through the house like a countdown to something final and irreversible. Robert and I stood in the silence after the front door closed, surrounded by the debris of what was supposed to have been a celebration of our marriage. "Well," he said finally, "that was interesting." I started laughing then, the kind of laughter that comes from exhaustion and relief, and the strange joy of finally standing up for yourself after months of swallowing humiliation. "Interesting is one word for it," I said. Robert put his arms around me, and we stood there in our living room, holding each other while the grandfather clock marked time and the roses in our garden continued blooming in defiance of the season. The next morning, I arrived at the bank early and reviewed Scott's loan file personally. David had already pulled it, as I'd requested, and left it on my desk with a note. "All payments current, no issues identified." I studied every page of the application, every piece of documentation, every signature. Everything was legitimate, properly processed, fully compliant with banking regulations, which meant Scott and Jessica's mortgage was just like any other mortgage, subject to the terms and conditions they'd agreed to when they signed the papers. I called Helen, my attorney. "The trust documents are nearly ready," she told me. "Are you still certain about excluding Scott?" "Completely certain. In fact, I want to add something else. I want to establish a foundation, the Lindsay Morrison Foundation, named after my mother. It will provide financial literacy education and small business loans for women over 50 who are starting new careers or businesses." "That's a lovely tribute to your mother," Helen said. "How much are you planning to fund it with?" I thought about my mother, who died when I was 35, just as my career was really taking off. She'd been widowed young, had worked multiple jobs to support her children, had never had the chance to build real financial security. She would have loved the idea of helping other women who found themselves starting over later in life. "The house," I said, "when Robert and I die, the house goes to the foundation. They can sell it and use the proceeds for their programs." It felt right. Instead of the house becoming a source of conflict and entitlement, it would become a source of empowerment for women who needed it most. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Benjamin Gray. "Rachel, we've got a situation with the Morrison account. They're requesting a payment modification. They want to restructure the loan terms." I wasn't surprised. Jessica had quit her job, and while Scott's salary was decent, carrying a $485,000 mortgage on a single income was challenging, especially with Jessica's expensive tastes. What kind of modification are they requesting? Lower monthly payments, extended term. They're claiming financial hardship. Financial hardship. Based on what I'd observed, their hardship was entirely self-inflicted, the result of Jessica's shopping habits and their refusal to live within their means. "Schedule a meeting," I said. "I'll handle it personally." "Are you sure that's appropriate, given your relationship?" "My relationship with Mr. Morrison is that of bank president to customer, nothing more." Scott walked into my office the following Tuesday, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He was alone. Apparently Jessica hadn't wanted to sully herself with actual banking business. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "Hello, Scott. Please sit down." The formal tone made him wince, but he sat in the chair across from my desk, looking small and miserable. "I understand you're requesting a loan modification," I said, opening his file. "Yeah, we're having some cash flow issues, and Jessica thought—" "Let me stop you there," I said. "I'm going to handle this exactly as I would any other loan modification request. I'm going to review your financial situation objectively and make a determination based on banking criteria, not family relationships. He nodded miserably. Your income hasn't changed since you took out the original loan 6 months ago. Your expenses, however, have increased significantly. I see credit card debt that wasn't on your original application, a car loan for a luxury vehicle, and numerous retail charges. Can you explain these changes? Jessica wanted to establish our lifestyle, he said defensively. The car lease, the furniture, the clothes. It's all about creating the right impression. The right impression. For whom? And why? Scott, when you applied for this mortgage, you signed documents stating that your financial situation was accurately represented. You made commitments based on your ability to pay. What you're describing isn't financial hardship. It's poor financial management. His face flushed red. So you're saying no? Just like that? I'm saying that based on your current financial picture, you don't qualify for the modification you're requesting. However, I can offer you some alternatives. Like what? You could sell the luxury car and purchase something more affordable. You could eliminate unnecessary expenses. You could ask your wife to return to work. Or, I paused, watching his face. You could sell the house and find something more within your means. We can't sell, he said quickly. Jessica loves that house. It's our dream home. Our dream home. A house they'd owned for 6 months, purchased with money they couldn't actually afford to spend, now threatened because they'd prioritized lifestyle over financial stability. Then you'll need to find other ways to make the payments work. Scott stared at me across the desk, this woman who'd been his mother for 32 years, but was now, in this moment, purely a banking professional making business decisions. This is about the party, isn't it? He said finally. You're still mad about Jessica. This is about mathematics, Scott. Your income minus your expenses equals a negative number. That's not sustainable long term, and it's not the bank's responsibility to enable poor financial choices. She's your daughter-in-law, he said desperately. Doesn't that matter? I thought about Jessica's face 3 weeks ago, the triumph in her eyes when she dismissed me as the help, the casual cruelty with which she'd suggested I commit federal crimes to fund her social ambitions. I have a daughter-in-law who treats me with respect and kindness, I said quietly. Her name is Nicole, and she's married to your brother David. Jessica is simply the woman you married. The distinction was subtle but complete. Nicole had never asked us to downsize our home, had never treated me like a servant, had never suggested I abuse my professional position for her benefit. Nicole understood that family relationships required mutual respect. Scott left my office that day without getting the loan modification he'd requested. 2 weeks later, I heard through the banking grapevine that he and Jessica had refinanced through a different institution at a much higher interest rate. 3 months after that, I got a call from Scott. Mom, we need to talk. About what? About everything. About Jessica, about the party, about us. We met at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where we could speak as equals rather than as mother and son or banker and customer. Jessica left, he said without preamble. I wasn't surprised, but I was sorry. Sorry that my son was hurting. Sorry that his marriage had failed. Sorry that he'd learned such a hard lesson about choosing partners based on infatuation rather than character. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and meant it. She said I was weak. Said I should have made you give us money, should have convinced you to sell the house and split the proceeds with us. She said a real man would put his wife first, no matter what. And what do you think? He was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers. I think I confused putting her first with letting her treat everyone else badly, he said finally. I thought being a good husband meant supporting everything she wanted, even when what she wanted was wrong. It was the beginning of wisdom, though it had come at a terrible cost. Jessica was never going to be satisfied, I told him gently. Even if we'd given her everything she wanted, the house, the money, my professional compromises, there would have been something else. Someone like Jessica doesn't want partnership. She wants control. Scott nodded slowly. I see that now. I guess I was so afraid of losing her that I lost myself instead. And lost us, I said quietly. Yeah, and lost you. His voice cracked a little. I'm so sorry, Mom, for all of it. For not standing up for you, for letting her treat you that way, for choosing her comfort over your dignity. I was a coward. The apology meant something, but it couldn't undo the damage. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal quickly or easily. What happened to the house? I asked. Foreclosure. We couldn't make the payments, especially after Jessica maxed out all the credit cards before she left. She took everything that wasn't nailed down: jewelry, electronics, even some of my grandmother's china she'd insisted we borrow from you. I remembered that china, my mother's wedding set, pieces I'd carefully preserved for decades. The thought of Jessica pawning them for quick cash made my chest tight with anger. I tried to call you, he continued, when it all started falling apart, but I didn't know what to say. How do you apologize for betraying the person who gave you everything? You start by acknowledging what you did wrong, I said, which you just did. Is there any chance, he began, then stopped. Never mind. I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't about rights, Scott. It's about healing. But healing takes time, and it requires changed behavior, not just changed words. We sat in silence for a while, two people who'd once been as close as a mother and son could be, now trying to figure out if there was a path back to each other. I've been going to therapy, he said on. He stayed basically, trying to understand how I let things get so bad. The therapist says I have trouble with boundaries, with saying no to people I'm afraid of losing. That's good, Faye, I said. Self-awareness is the first step. She also says I need to make amends, not just apologize, but actually try to repair the damage I caused. So I wanted you to know I'm working 2 jobs now, trying to pay back the money Jessica stole. It's not much yet, but I'm keeping track of everything, and I will pay it back. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about accountability, about taking responsibility for the choices he'd made and their consequences. What are your plans now? I asked. I'm renting a studio apartment downtown. It's small, but it's clean and it's mine. I'm rebuilding my credit, trying to get my finances back on track, and I'm staying single for a while. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be what someone else wants me to be. For the first time since he'd walked into the coffee shop, I felt a stirring of hope. This was the son I'd raised, the one who took responsibility, who learned from mistakes, who understood that being an adult meant making hard choices and living with the consequences. That sounds like a good plan, I said. I know I don't deserve it, but I was hoping maybe we could have coffee again sometime. Not right away, and not if you're not ready, but maybe eventually. I looked at this man who was my son, who'd broken my heart and was now trying to put the pieces back together. The anger was still there, the hurt was still raw, but underneath it all was something that had never disappeared, love. Maybe, I said, eventually. 6 months later, Scott started coming to Sunday dinners again. Not every week, and never without calling first to make sure it was okay. He brought flowers for me and always offered to help clean up afterward. He listened to Robert's stories with genuine interest and asked thoughtful questions about my work at the bank. He never mentioned Jessica, and neither did we. A year after that, he met Nicole, not my daughter-in-law Nicole, but a different Nicole who worked as a social worker and drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic and understood that love meant building something together, not tearing other people down to get what you wanted. When he brought her to meet us, she complimented my garden, asked thoughtful questions about Robert's art, and insisted on helping with the dishes despite my protests. She was nothing like Jessica, quieter, kinder, more thoughtful. She treated us like people she was genuinely interested in getting to know, not obstacles to be managed or resources to be exploited. She's lovely, I told Scott privately as they were getting ready to leave that first evening. She really is, he said. And Mom, she knows everything. About Jessica, about what I did, about how badly I screwed up. She says everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes and become better. She sounds like a wise woman. She is, and she makes me want to be the kind of man who deserves her. They married 2 years later in our backyard, surrounded by roses that Robert and I had spent decades nurturing. Nicole wore my mother's pearls, the ones Jessica had tried to borrow, but that I'd quietly moved to my safe deposit box after that disastrous anniversary party. During the ceremony, as I watched my son promise to love and honor this good woman who'd helped him become a better man, I thought about forgiveness and second chances and the long, complicated process of rebuilding trust. The Lindsay Morrison Foundation had been operating for 3 years by then, funded not just by my estate planning but by annual donations from Robert and me. We'd helped 17 women start new businesses or return to school, provided financial literacy classes to over 200 participants, and created a network of support that extended far beyond money. One of our success stories was a woman named Linda, 62 years old, who'd been left with nothing when her husband divorced her for a younger woman after 35 years of marriage. She'd used our small business loan program to start a catering company that now employed 8 people and was booked solid 6 months in advance. "You gave me more than money," she'd told me at our annual foundation dinner. "You gave me the chance to prove to myself that I was capable of more than I ever imagined." That, I realized, was what I'd been trying to give Scott all along. Not just financial support or family loyalty, but the chance to become the person he was capable of being. Sometimes that meant saying no, setting boundaries, allowing people to face the consequences of their choices. Jessica, as far as I knew, had moved on to her next victim. I'd heard through the town gossip network that she was engaged to a man 30 years her senior, a widower with substantial assets and adult children who were reportedly not thrilled about their father's new relationship. I felt sorry for him, but I didn't feel responsible. Everyone has to learn their own lessons, make their own choices, face their own consequences. As for Robert and me, we were still living in our 5-bedroom house, still tending our garden, still making decisions about our own lives without consulting anyone else about what we should or shouldn't do based on our age. Robert had just had his most successful gallery show in years, selling 12 paintings to collectors who appreciated his decades of artistic evolution. At 73, he was painting with more confidence and creativity than ever, finally free from the need to prove himself to anyone. I'd just been re-elected to my 3rd term as bank president, with unanimous support from the board of directors. At 71, I was mentoring younger employees, serving on community development committees, and using my decades of experience to help guide the bank through an increasingly complex financial landscape. We weren't slowing down, we were hitting our stride. The house that Jessica had coveted, the space she'd thought we were too old to deserve, had become the center of a rich, full life that included regular dinner parties, holiday celebrations, foundation meetings, and quiet evenings when Robert and I sat on our back porch, watching the roses bloom and reflecting on how fortunate we were to have built something lasting together. On the 5th anniversary of that disastrous party, Robert and I celebrated our 52nd wedding anniversary with a small gathering of people who actually loved and respected us. Scott and Nicole were there along with our other children and their families, several close friends, and Linda from the foundation, who'd become dear to us over the years. There was no drama, no manipulation, no suggestions that we were too old for our own lives. There were just people who cared about each other, celebrating love that had endured and grown stronger through decades of challenges and changes. As I looked around our living room that evening, the same room where Jessica had dismissed me as the help 5 years earlier, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not the bitter satisfaction of revenge, but the peaceful satisfaction of boundaries maintained, dignity preserved, and wisdom earned through experience. Sometimes the best response to cruelty isn't elaborate revenge. Sometimes it's simply refusing to participate in your own diminishment, setting clear boundaries, and building a life so rich and full that other people's opinions become irrelevant. Jessica had tried to make me small, tried to reduce me to nothing more than an obstacle to her ambitions. Instead, she'd helped me rediscover my own strength, my own worth, my own capacity for decisive action when action was required. The bank still carries the Morrison loan in its files, marked paid in full, after Scott worked those 2 jobs for 3 years to clear his debts. The Lindsay Morrison Foundation continues to help women rebuild their lives after setbacks and betrayals. The roses in our garden bloom every year, tended by hands that have learned when to nurture and when to prune away what doesn't serve the greater good. And I'm still here, still making decisions about my own life, still president of my own destiny, still very much not the help. Some lessons are worth learning no matter how much they cost to acquire.